My name is Thomas Weaver. For the last 284 days, my entire world has been this rock, this tower, and the light it keeps. St. Jude's Rock, they call it. A jagged black tooth sticking out of the Atlantic, 12 miles off the coast of Maine. The lighthouse itself is a relic, a 150-foot-tall cylinder of granite and iron, built to defy a sea that never stops trying to reclaim it. Most lighthouses are automated now, of course, but St. Jude's is special. It houses an experimental deep-range sonar relay alongside the light, government contract stuff I'm not supposed to touch. So they still need a caretaker, a warm body to make sure the machines stay happy. That's me. I took the job to get away from the noise of a life that had fallen apart, the noise of pitying friends, the noise of my own memories playing on a loop. Here, the only sounds are the ones that matter. The shriek of the gulls, the endless whisper and roar of the water, and the low, comforting hum of the diesel generator in the belly of this rock. And the foghorn, of course, a long, mournful bass note that sings the world a warning. On St. Jude's, loneliness is a physical presence. It's in the salt that crusts the windows and the damp chill that clings to the stone walls. I've learned to live with it. We've become quiet companions. My routine is the anchor that keeps me from drifting. Dawn, check the light, inspect the lens. Morning, run diagnostics on the generator, check the fuel levels. Afternoon, maintenance, cleaning, reading. But the nights are for listening. My one luxury, my one true link to the world I left behind, is a vintage Hallicrafters SX100 ham radio. It sits in the small living space at the base of the tower, a heavy metal box filled with glowing vacuum tubes, my father's. On clear nights, I can pull voices out of the static from Halifax, Miami, sometimes even a stray signal from a freighter off the coast of Ireland. It's a reminder that there are millions of other people out there, living their loud, complicated lives. Tonight, the fog was thick as wool, a real pea souper, as the old sailors called it. The foghorn was bellowing its heart out every 2 minutes. Inside, the air was still and warm. I had a cup of tea steaming on the desk and was slowly turning the weighted knob on the Hallicrafters, surfing the shortwave bands. The usual chatter was there, the crackle of distant thunderstorms, the faint garbled talk of fishermen, and the steady dit-dit-da of a coastal weather station. I pushed past the 30-meter band, heading into the quieter, more obscure frequencies, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't static. It wasn't Morse code. It wasn't a voice. It was a sequence of deep, resonant pulses, so low they were felt more than heard, a vibration in the bones of my skull. It was uncannily clean, rising from the ocean's hiss with perfect clarity. The pattern was deliberate and structured, 2 quick pulses, a breath of perfect silence, and then a single, slightly longer pulse. It repeated over and over with the precise, unwavering regularity of an atomic clock. It was the sound of a machine, but unlike any machine I knew. My first thought was a submarine. Russian, maybe? Or one of ours, running silent and testing some new sonar? But the frequency was all wrong. And there was no Doppler effect, no sense of movement. It was perfectly stationary. I checked my charts. There was nothing out here. Nothing but a trench, the St. Jude's Deeps, that plunged to over 2,000 feet just a mile east of the rock. For an hour, I sat there, headphones pressed to my ears, barely breathing. The signal never wavered. It was hypnotic. It felt ancient, patient, like a clock that had been ticking in an empty room for 1,000 years. I adjusted the fine-tuning knob, just a fraction of a millimeter to the right, trying to clean up the sound. As the static cleared just a tiny bit, the signal suddenly stopped. The The silence that rushed in was more startling than the sound had been. I held my breath, waiting. 10 seconds. 30. A full minute. Nothing. Had I imagined it? Was it just a phantom echo in the machine? Disappointed, I started to pull the headphones away, and then it came back. But it was different. A single pulse, the pause, and then the double. The pattern had inverted. It felt less like a broadcast and more like a reply. It was as if the simple act of me focusing on it, of me listening, had somehow alerted it to my presence. The cold chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the damp sea air. Here on my lonely rock, surrounded by the cold, dark Atlantic, I was no longer listening. I was being listened to.
Sleep didn't come that night. How could it? I sat in that wooden chair until my muscles ached, the headphones feeling like a permanent part of my skull. The signal, the inverted pattern, continued for exactly 1 hour, and then vanished, melting back into the ocean's static as if it had never been there. The silence it left behind was profound, heavier than before. It was the silence of an empty stage, the audience holding its breath for the second act. I went up to the lantern room and watched the beams slice through the fog, but for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt observed. The next day was a blur of caffeine and obsessive research. I tore through every manual on the island. I read up on the sonar relay equipment I was forbidden from touching, studied the maritime charts, looked for any record of geological surveys of the St. Jude's deeps. Nothing. The official record stated that the seabed beneath me was cold, dead, and uninteresting. My satellite internet connection is slow, a relic of a service that barely functions, but I spent hours forcing it to load obscure scientific forums and declassified naval reports. I searched for unidentified submarine acoustics, rhythmic seismic events, deep-sea bioacoustic signals. I found crackpot theories and vague reports, but nothing that matched the clean, intelligent pattern I had heard. Every logical part of my brain screamed for a rational explanation. It had to be a malfunction. My antique radio finally giving up the ghost. Or maybe it was me. Maybe the isolation was finally winning, creating auditory hallucinations to fill the silence. The thought was terrifying. Was this how it started? A slow, quiet slide into madness, with only the gulls as witnesses? But it felt too real, too structured. And the change, the inversion of the pattern right after I'd fine-tuned the receiver, that wasn't a random event. By evening, as a bruised purple twilight settled over the Atlantic, I knew I couldn't just wait and listen again. I had to do something. I had to knock back. I had to see if the house across the street was truly empty or if a face would appear in the window. The problem was, I had no way to transmit into the deep ocean. I had my ham radio for the airwaves, but the water was a different world. Then my eyes fell on the main circuit breaker for the tower, a thick, heavy black lever that controlled everything on this rock. The light, the sonar relay, the generator's flow. It was the island's heart, and I could stop it with the flick of a wrist. My plan was crude, probably insane. I would shut down the entire island. For just a few seconds, I would plunge St. Jude's into total silence and darkness. I would kill the constant electrical hum that permeated this place. It would be my signal, a single massive pulse in the electromagnetic field, a sudden stop in the flow of energy that had been constant for decades. It was the loudest, most primitive shout I could manage into the abyss. At precisely 10 p.m., the time the signal had first appeared, I took a deep breath and pulled the main breaker. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The generator hum died. The lights in the room went out. The reassuring glow from the equipment flickered off. For the first time since I had arrived, the lighthouse was dead. The silence was a physical blow. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart and the ageless murmur of the sea. I stood in total darkness, a blind man on a dead rock. The 5 seconds I'd allotted myself felt like an eternity. Then, with a grunt, I threw the lever back up. The generator coughed, then roared back to life. The lights flickered on. The hum returned. St. Jude's was alive again. I scrambled back to my radio, my hands shaking as I put on the headphones. Static. Just static. 1 minute passed. Then 2. My heart sank. It had been nothing. A coincidence. I was a fool, a lonely man playing games with himself in the dark. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me, so strong it was almost nauseating. I was about to turn the radio off when a single, sharp click came through the headphones. Then, the pulse began. It was no longer a simple heartbeat. It was fast, complex, a cascade of rhythmic beats and pauses. Thump, 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 thump. It was a torrent of information, a frantic, excited reply. It was so different from the patient, measured pulse from before. This was an answer. This was a conversation. I grabbed a pen and a maintenance logbook, my mind racing. I started to scribble down the patter, using dots for short beats and dashes for longer ones, a desperate attempt to transcribe the impossible. Dot, 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 dash, dot, dot, dash. My hand could barely keep up. As I stared at the frantic scribbles filling the page, a cold dread and wonder washed over me. This wasn't random. It wasn't noise. The patterns, the groupings, they were sequences, prime numbers. The Fibonacci sequence transmitted into a series of grouped pulses. It was a universal greeting card, a mathematical language primer. It wasn't just showing me that it was intelligent, it was trying to teach me how to talk back.
For the next 3 nights, I was no longer a lighthouse keeper. I was a cryptographer, a student, a priest receiving a gospel from a god I couldn't name. I slept in 2-hour bursts, my body screaming for rest, but my mind refusing to shut down. The logbook filled with pages of dots and dashes, of numbers and sequences. The signal was a patient teacher. It would transmit a concept, say the atomic weight of hydrogen, and then repeat it over and over until I found a way to respond. My method of reply was clumsy, brutal even. I used the main breaker. A short flick off and on was a dot, a longer one a dash. It was like trying to tap dance in iron boots, but it was all I had. I would send back the sequence it taught me, my own slow, thudding acknowledgement. Each time I successfully mirrored a sequence, the signal would pause, as if in recognition, and then introduce a new concept. We moved from basic mathematics and physics to chemistry, the periodic table, the double helix structure of DNA. It was a staggering, relentless flood of information. It was teaching me the fundamentals of the universe as it understood them. But who or what was the teacher? I started to form a picture in my mind, a fantasy born of isolation and awe. I imagined a probe, a machine of immense age lying dormant in the crushing dark of the St. Jude's deeps. Perhaps it was a repository of knowledge, a library left behind by a traveling civilization millions of years ago, waiting for a fledgling intelligence like ours to accidentally tune to the right frequency. It felt benign. A cosmic message in a bottle, and I was the one lucky enough to find it. That comfortable theory was shattered on the 4th night. I had just confirmed the sequence for the speed of light, my arm aching from working the heavy breaker switch. The signal paused, as usual. I waited for the next lesson, my pen poised over a fresh page in the logbook. But no new mathematical pattern came. Instead, a low hum started to rise from the radio, a single, sustained tone. It grew in volume, making the speaker on the old Hallicrafters vibrate. And then the light bulb above my desk flickered. I looked up. It flickered again in perfect time with a pulse from the radio. Flicker, flicker, flicker. My heartbeat from the first night, my own signal, played back to me not in sound, but in light. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a broadcast anymore. It had moved beyond the radio.
It was directly interacting with the electrical systems of the lighthouse. It was inside my home. I backed away from the desk, my eyes darting around the room. The small digital clock on the microwave began to flash random numbers. The needle on the generator's fuel gauge started twitching erratically. It was probing, testing the systems I controlled. It was learning the layout of my tiny kingdom. The feeling of a benign, distant teacher evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization that I was in a cage with something that was now rattling the bars. Then, the images came. They weren't on a screen. They bloomed behind my eyes, directly into my consciousness. They were faint at first, like the ghost of a photograph. A flash of impossible geometry. A city of spiraling towers made of a material that was both dark and luminous. Then a glimpse of a sky with two suns. Then a creature. It was brief, barely a silhouette, but it was enough. It was vast, aquatic, with limbs like flowing ribbons of shadow. It was nothing like the little green men of fiction. It was majestic and terrifying. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair, and cried out. The images vanished, the hum in the radio stopped, the lights steadied. The room was silent again, except for my own ragged breathing. I understood then. This wasn't just a library. It was a being. And it wasn't trapped in the deeps. It was connected to it. The water wasn't its prison, it was its medium. The signal wasn't just a call, it was its voice. And after centuries of silence, it was finally awake. And it was hungry. Not for food, but for contact, for knowledge, for me. It had learned my math, my physics. Now it wanted to learn what was inside my head.
Panic is a cold, clean thing. It strips away all the complex thoughts, the wonder, the curiosity, and leaves you with one primal instinct: flight. I scrambled away from the radio, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ripped the headphones from my ears as if they were burning, and in a fit of pure terror, I yanked the Hollycrafter's power cord from the wall socket. The tubes faded, the faint glow died, and the machine went silent. My first thought was to cut the power to the whole island again, but I couldn't. A storm was rolling in from the north, and a fishing trawler had radioed in earlier about engine trouble. The light was not a toy. It was a promise, a duty. To let it go out was to potentially sign a death warrant for a dozen fishermen. My own fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. For the rest of the night, I was a ghost on my own island, flinching at every shadow, every creak of the old tower. I did my rounds, checked the light, but I felt a constant itching pressure at the base of my skull. It was the feeling of a phone ringing in a room you can't get into. The entity was still there, waiting. My silence was an answer in itself, and it was not one the being was willing to accept. The next evening, it decided to ring louder. It started with the lights, not just the one above my desk, but every light bulb in the lighthouse and the adjoining keeper's house. They began to dim and brighten in the complex mathematical sequences from the night before. The entire tower was pulsing with a silent, alien language. I ran outside into the wind and rain, but there was no escape. The colossal lamp in the lantern room, the one that could cut through miles of ocean darkness, was doing it too. Its powerful sweeping beam was no longer steady. It was flickering, sending a stream of prime numbers out into the stormy night. Then came the foghorn. The deep, mournful bellow I knew so well was replaced by a series of controlled staccato blasts, short and long notes echoing the dots and dashes I'd scribbled in my logbook. It was shouting its lessons into the storm for anyone to hear. It was a terrifying, magnificent, and utterly insane symphony. Overwhelmed, I collapsed onto the wet rocks, clutching my head as the visions returned, stronger this time, impossible to ignore. They weren't flashes anymore. They were memories. Its memories. I saw the darkness between stars, the slow, silent waltz of galaxies. I saw it arrive, a being of immense size and fluid grace, plunging into the primordial oceans of a young volcanic Earth. It wasn't a crash. It was an arrival, a hibernation. I saw the long, silent centuries pass from its perspective at the bottom of the sea, the slow drift of continents, the rise and fall of strange, prehistoric leviathans, the dimming and brightening of the sun overhead. I felt its loneliness. It was a colossal, cosmic solitude that made my own self-pitying isolation feel like a crowded room. It had been sleeping, dreaming, and waiting. Waiting for a mind to appear on the planet above that was capable of hearing it. Waiting for me. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed. It was tempered by a profound, heartbreaking empathy. This being wasn't a monster. It was a castaway. And in its own overwhelming way, it was just trying to say hello. My clumsy attempts at communication, the flicking of the breaker, had been the first voice it had heard in millennia. As the storm and the chaotic symphony raged around me, the flood of images in my head coalesced into one final, sharp picture. It was a place on the mainland, a series of large white satellite dishes pointed towards the sky, nestled in a remote wooded valley, a government facility, anonymous and sterile. Wires ran from the dishes to a concrete bunker-like building. The vision was a warning. It was showing me that my clumsy conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. It wasn't just the fishermen and the gulls who might see the lighthouse's strange new rhythm. Someone else, someone with far more sophisticated radios than my old Hollycrafters, was also listening.
The storm broke just before dawn. The manic energy of the previous night vanished with it. The light returned to its steady, sweeping rhythm. The foghorn fell silent. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath. The vision of the satellite dishes, the warning, was burned into my mind. I was no longer just dealing with a cosmic entity. I was on the radar of a very terrestrial and likely very dangerous human organization. I spent the morning in a frantic state of high alert. I used the high-powered binoculars I kept in the lantern room to scan the horizon. The sea was empty. The sky was clear. There were no boats, no helicopters, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The silence was not a reprieve, it was a countdown. The being in the deeps was quiet too. The radio remained dead even after I found the courage to plug it back in. The lights were steady. It was as if it had said its piece and was now waiting for my next move. The warning it had given me was a gesture of trust, a profound one. It had revealed a threat to me and by extension to itself. We were, in a strange way, co-conspirators now. My options were grim. I could try to destroy the radio, cut the power, and pretend none of this ever happened. But I knew it was too late. Whatever instruments they had at that facility were far more sensitive than my antique receiver. They didn't just hear the signal, they would have analyzed it. They would have seen the lighthouse itself become an alien transmitter during the storm. They would be coming. My other option was to continue the conversation, to try and understand, to warn it. But how do you explain human paranoia and secret government agencies to a creature that has slept through the rise of continents? Around noon, I saw it, a dark speck on the horizon, growing steadily larger. It wasn't a fishing boat. It was a sleek, gray vessel with no markings, cutting through the waves at high speed. It moved with a chilling efficiency. My heart pounded in my chest. They were here. I had maybe 30 minutes. Running was impossible. I was on a rock in the middle of the ocean. Hiding was pointless. There was nowhere on this barren island they wouldn't look. That left one choice: prepare. I raced down to the base of the tower, to the generator room. The diesel engine was the heart of this island, and I knew every pipe, every wire, every valve. I thought about sabotage, about disabling the lighthouse to cover my tracks. But that would be a confession. I needed to act like an ignorant caretaker, a man who had seen nothing, heard nothing. My eyes fell on my logbook, sitting on the desk next to the silent radio. It was filled with the evidence of my contact, page after page of impossible knowledge. It was the most important document in human history, and I couldn't let them find it. Burning it felt like a sacrilege, but I had no choice. I took it to the small cast iron stove I used for heat, and with a heavy heart, I lit the first page. I watched as the numbers and patterns, the language of the stars, turned to black ash. As the boat grew closer, now visible as a military-style patrol craft, I formulated a plan, a desperate, flimsy one. I would be Tom Weaver, the lonely, slightly dim-witted lighthouse keeper. I'd feign ignorance about any electrical surges during the storm. I'd blame the flickering lights on the old wiring and the foghorn's strange behavior on a faulty compressor. It was a weak story, but it was all I had. I stood on the small concrete pier as the gray boat docked, its engines humming with quiet power. 2 men disembarked. They were not in uniform. They wore plain, black, waterproof jackets and trousers. They looked polite, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. They had the cold, competent air of men who were used to getting answers. "Thomas Weaver?" the first man asked. His voice was calm, unremarkable. It was the kind of voice you would immediately forget. "That's me," I said, forcing a slightly confused but friendly tone. "Didn't expect any visitors today. Supply boat isn't due till Friday." The second man didn't speak. He was already scanning the tower, his eyes lingering on the massive lantern, the foghorn, the thick power cables running down the stone. "We're from the Federal Communications Commission," the first man said, holding up an ID that looked vaguely official. "We detected some highly unusual atmospheric and submarine signal interference originating from this sector during last night's storm. We're just here to inspect your equipment to make sure it isn't a source of contamination." Federal Communications Commission. It was a lie so plausible, so boring, that it was almost brilliant. But I knew what they were really here for. They weren't here to inspect the equipment. They were here to inspect me.
I led them inside. "Be my guest," I said, trying to sound as cooperative as possible. "The wiring in this old beast is a constant headache. If you can find a problem, you'll be doing me a favor." The first man, the talker, introduced himself as Mr. Jones. The silent one was Mr. Smith. It was so cliché, it would have been funny in any other circumstance. Smith immediately went to the generator room, pulling a sophisticated-looking handheld device from his jacket. It looked like a spectrum analyzer, but far more advanced than anything I'd ever seen. Jones stayed with me, his eyes taking in every detail of my small living space. "Lived here long, Mr. Weaver?" he asked, his tone conversational, but his gaze was sharp, analytical. "Just over 9 months," I replied, busying myself by making a pot of coffee, my hands moving with a deliberate, practiced calm. "Feels like a lifetime, though. You lose track of the days out here." "I can imagine. Must be lonely." He wasn't asking, he was probing, testing the edges of my psychology. "I came here for the quiet. I'm not much for people." His eyes landed on the Hallicrafter's radio. I had plugged it back in, made it look like it was a part of the room, not a tool I had desperately tried to silence. "That's a beautiful piece of equipment," Jones said, walking over to it. "A classic. Do you get much use out of it?" "Just a hobby. Helps pass the time. Mostly static, but sometimes you can catch a fishing crew complaining about their catch." He ran a gloved finger over the main tuning knob, the same one I had used to first find the signal. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to turn it on, but he just smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "My grandfather had one of these, said you could hear the world with it if you were patient enough." Down below, I heard a metallic clang, then Smith's footsteps returning. He appeared at the doorway and gave Jones a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. My feigned ignorance and scorched logbook had paid off, it seemed.
Their instruments found nothing. No lingering radiation, no strange energy signatures. The being in the deeps was remaining perfectly silent, shielding me. "Well," Jones said, turning from the radio, "everything seems to be in order. The energy spikes we registered must have been a result of the atmospheric conditions during the storm, interacting with the local geology. It happens." It was a dismissal, a cover story, neatly packaged and delivered. But we both knew he didn't believe a word of it. They started to leave, and I felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. I had passed the test. I had survived. As they stepped back onto the pier, Jones paused and turned back to me. "One last thing, Mr. Weaver," he said, his voice losing its friendly edge, becoming as cold and gray as the sea. "This is a federally protected installation due to the sensitive equipment it houses. If you notice any further anomalies, unusual signals, power fluctuations, anything out of the ordinary, you are mandated to report it to us directly." He handed me a small laminated card. It had no name, no agency crest, just a single phone number. We wouldn't want unauthorized parties taking an interest in this location. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. "We know you're hiding something, and we are the only ones you're allowed to talk to about it." I watched their boat speed away until it was just a speck again, my hand clenching the card. The immediate danger had passed, but my situation had become infinitely more complex. I was no longer a lonely man who had stumbled upon a cosmic secret. I was a person of interest, a pawn in a game I didn't understand, caught between two immense and powerful forces, an ancient alien intelligence at the bottom of the ocean, and a shadowy human organization that would stop at nothing to control it. The relief I'd felt curdled into a new kind of fear. Jones and Smith hadn't found any evidence, but they weren't convinced. They hadn't come here just to check on a signal. They had come to assess me, and they would be back. I was now the guardian of the lighthouse and the keeper of its secret, and both were under siege.
After the gray boat disappeared, the island felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. I spent the next several hours searching it, a paranoid tremor in my hands. I checked for listening devices in the outlets, for micro cameras in the lamps, for anything that felt out of place. I found nothing. This was somehow worse. It meant their surveillance was likely remote, sophisticated, and completely beyond my ability to detect. They hadn't just bugged my home, they had bugged my entire world. The card Jones had given me felt heavy in my pocket, a constant toxic reminder of their presence. I was trapped. If I remained silent, they would grow suspicious. If I reported the truth, I would be betraying the ancient being that had trusted me. For the first time, I felt a flicker of anger towards the entity. Its decision to contact me had destroyed my quiet life and placed me in incredible danger. But the feeling was fleeting, replaced by a weary sense of responsibility. We were in this together now. That night, with a sense of grim determination, I plugged the Halocrafters back in and turned it on. I had to talk to it. I had to know what we were up against. I waited, the faint hiss of the empty frequency filling the room. The response came, but it was different. There were no more numbers, no more physics lessons. Instead, a pure, clean tone emerged from the speaker. It rose and fell in pitch, mimicking the cadence of a human voice. There were no words, but the intent was clear. There was a questioning tone, a feeling of concern. It was asking if I was all right. It had felt my fear. "They were here," I whispered, not knowing if my voice could possibly carry, but needing to say it out loud. "They know. They don't understand." As if in reply, the tone from the radio stopped, and a new vision flooded my mind. It was clearer than before, a fully formed memory. It was not a vision of a distant alien world, but of my own. The scene was dated, the grainy quality of old film, the outdated technology, the clothes.
It was a military sonar station from the Cold War, maybe the early 1970s. Young men with short haircuts and headsets stared intently at glowing green screens. I saw one of them, a sonar operator, jolt upright. On his screen was a signal that didn't belong, a slow, rhythmic pulse. Thump, thump, thump. My signal. I felt the operator's excitement, his academic curiosity, his awe. I saw him show his commanding officer, saw the flurry of reports being filed, the hushed phone calls to shadowy superiors. Then the scene shifted. I was no longer in the sonar room. I was in the deep, looking up. I was seeing the world from the entity's perspective. I saw the hulls of Navy destroyers gathering on the surface above. I felt the entity's own cautious curiosity as it watched them. It reached out, just as it had done with me, with a simple mathematical sequence. A greeting. The response was not a greeting. The vision became a chaotic nightmare of sound and pressure. Explosions blossomed in the water around me, depth shocks. Concussive shock waves tore through the entity's consciousness, a wave of pure, meaningless violence. Then came a high-frequency sonar blast of incredible power, a piercing shriek designed to map, to penetrate, to hurt. It was an act of aggression, of fear. They weren't trying to communicate, they were trying to capture or kill what they didn't understand. I felt the entity's immense pain, its confusion, and its deep, resounding sorrow. And then I felt it retreat, shutting down all communication, pulling its consciousness deep into the abyss to heal and to hide, where it had remained silent for 50 years, until my old radio had accidentally whispered in its ear. The vision faded, leaving me trembling in my chair. I finally understood. The being in the deep wasn't just lonely, it was traumatized. It had reached out to my species once before and had been met with violence. Jones and Smith were the direct descendants of that violence, the keepers of that fearful, aggressive secret. My purpose became crystal clear. This was no longer just about contact, it was about protection. My quiet lighthouse had become the front line in a silent, 50-year-old Cold War. I looked down at the card in my hand, at the stark, black numbers. The entity had been hiding, but now that it had been found again, hiding was no longer enough. We had to play the game.
Waiting for an enemy you cannot see is a special kind of poison. Every creak of the old tower, every splash of a wave against the rock felt like the prelude to an assault. I was a sentry on a watchtower, but my enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The card Jones had given me felt like a burning coal in my pocket. He had told me to report anomalies. Fine, I would give him an anomaly. But I couldn't do it alone. This had to be a coordinated deception. That evening, I sat at my desk, the radio humming softly, and laid out a nautical chart of the surrounding waters. I needed a new way to communicate, something more nuanced than shutting down the island's power. I uncapped a pen and wrote in big block letters on a blank page in a new notebook. Can you see this? I held the notebook up, concentrating on the words, pushing the thought towards the presence I now felt constantly at the edge of my senses. A single, rising tone came from the radio. Yes. My heart leaped. We had a new channel. I began to write, explaining my plan. Jones and Smith were expecting me to break. They were waiting for me to report the real signal. So we would give them a different one. A ghost, a decoy. I pointed my pen to a location on the chart, about 20 miles northeast of the lighthouse, the Oak Haven Ridge, a deep, geologically uninteresting stretch of seabed that happened to be near a major shipping lane. I wrote, "Can you make a sound? Over there. Not your real voice, an echo, something faint, something that will make them look." There was a long pause. The radio was silent. I could feel the entity's hesitation, its deep, ingrained fear. It had hidden for 50 years after its first violent encounter. I was asking it to reveal itself again, to deliberately draw the attention of the very monsters it feared. I was asking for an incredible act of trust. I held my breath, my entire plan hanging in the balance. Then, 2 tones from the radio. A low, falling note, followed by a high, rising one. No, yes. It was expressing its conflict, its fear, and then its agreement. It would do it. We were in this together. The next step was the hardest. I picked up the satellite phone, my only official link to the mainland, and with a trembling finger, I dialed the number on the laminated card. It rang only once. Yes. It was Joan's voice. No greeting, no identification, just that single cold word. I took a shaky breath, forcing a nervous tremor into my voice, playing the part of the reluctant, frightened citizen. Hello? This is Thomas Weaver from the St. Jude's Lighthouse. You told me to call if I'd noticed anything? I remember. Report. It's my radio, the ham radio. I've been picking something up for the past hour. It's very faint, but it's structured. A repeating signal. It's not Morse, it's something else. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of typing. What is your current frequency? I gave him a frequency near the real one, but slightly off. And what is the signal's bearing? This was the critical moment. It's hard to tell with my old equipment, I said, making my voice sound uncertain. But the signal seems strongest when I point my antenna northeast, towards the Oakhaven Ridge, maybe, near the shipping lanes. There was another silence, longer this time. I felt a cold sweat trickling down my back. He was analyzing it, cross-referencing, deciding if I was lying. He was a predator sniffing the air, and I was the prey trying to misdirect him with a false trail. Thank you for your report, Mr. Weaver, Jones said finally, his tone unchanging. Your diligence is noted. Do not discuss this signal with anyone. We will monitor the situation. Continue your duties as normal. The line went dead. I sank into my chair, the phone clattering onto the desk. It was done. The lie had been told. I had deliberately painted a target on the empty ocean, hoping they would send their ships and satellites and analysts chasing a ghost. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't just reacting. I was fighting back. But as I sat there in the humming silence of the tower, a terrifying question echoed in my mind. What if they didn't believe me? What if they saw my lie for what it was, a desperate attempt to protect something, and decided to come here to tear my island apart to find out what? The 3 days that followed my call to Jones were the longest of my life. I was a ghost in the lighthouse, moving through my duties on autopilot, my mind constantly elsewhere. I barely ate. I scanned the horizon with my binoculars until my eyes burned. Every distant fishing boat sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The silence from Jones was absolute. The silence from the deep was just as profound. The entity was trusting my plan, lying dormant while the hunters searched for its ghost. My island was no longer a cage. It was the calm center of a storm, and I had no way of knowing which way the winds would break. On the 4th morning, I saw it. It was just after dawn, the sky a soft gradient of orange and purple. Through the powerful lenses of the binoculars, aimed towards the northeast, I saw them. 2 ships. They were miles away, little more than specks, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. They weren't fishing trawlers or container ships. They were research vessels, bristling with antennas and the distinct profile of a sonar winch on the stern. Above them, a small plane circled in a slow, lazy pattern. They were exactly where I had told them to look. They had taken the bait. A laugh escaped my lips, a raw, cracked sound. It worked. I had sent the wolves on a chase after a rabbit, and the den was, for the moment, safe. That night, a profound sense of peace settled over the island. The threat had moved, for now. I sat with the radio, not to plan or conspire, but simply to be with my silent companion. As if sensing the change, the entity reached out. The communication was no longer about fear or strategy. It was a gift. The visions returned, but they were gentle, lucid dreams. It showed me its home. I floated through its memories of a world bathed in the light of two suns. I saw cities that were not built, but grown, their spiraling towers seeming to be carved from living coral and shimmering crystal. I felt the deep communal harmony of its species, their thoughts and feelings flowing between them like currents in the ocean. I experienced its sorrow, not for itself, but for its civilization, long gone, of which it was the last, lonely archivist. It was sharing the weight of its own soul with me, the only other soul it knew. In the heart of my profound isolation, I had found the most profound connection imaginable. We were two lonely beings, a man on a rock and a god in the deep, sharing the quiet dark. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of hope. Maybe there was a way through this. Maybe I could protect it. Maybe we could learn from each other, and I could, in some small way, help it carry the burden of its memories. I was in the lantern room, lost in a beautiful, silent vision of a star-filled nebula, when a new sound shattered the peace. It was not the sea. It was not the wind. It was a rhythmic, mechanical whump, 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 a sound of violent purpose that tore through the air. I snapped back to reality, my heart seizing in my chest. I scrambled to the window, my eyes searching the gray evening sky. It was a helicopter, a black, unmarked machine, flying low and fast, not from the direction of the mainland, but from the open ocean. It wasn't on a search pattern. It was making a direct line for the island, for me. The horrible truth crashed down on me in an instant. The ships, the plane, they weren't the primary force. They were the diversion. They were the loud, obvious gesture to make me think my trick had worked. They had played me. While I was distracted, watching their grand performance to the northeast, they had sent a small, quiet, brutally efficient team from the other direction. My call hadn't been a clever deception. It had been the final confirmation they needed. It had sprung their trap. The helicopter was getting closer, its noise a deafening roar now. There were men in black tactical gear visible in its open bay door. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. This was the end of the game. My desperate attempt to protect my friend had only led the enemy directly to its doorstep.
There was no time. The helicopter's landing skids were just feet from the rocks. Ropes were already being thrown from the bay door. In seconds, they would be inside. My mind, which had been filled with the serene beauty of distant galaxies, was now a vortex of pure animal terror. My instinct screamed at me to hide, to cower, to brace for the inevitable end. But my final duty was not to myself. I lunged for the desk, for the notebook, for the last message I would ever send. My hands were slick with sweat, the pen barely staying in my grip. What could I possibly say? How could I explain what was about to happen? There was no time for explanations, only for a command, a plea. I scribbled 3 words in huge, ragged letters, pushing every ounce of my will, my fear, and my friendship into them. Go, live, forget. As the first black-clad soldier rappelled onto the rocks below, I held the notebook up, my eyes shut tight, screaming the words in my mind. A final, desperate act of a zookeeper trying to save a dragon from a world that would only ever want it to put it in a cage. The response was not a tone or a vision. It was the entire world shaking. A low, subsonic hum began to emanate from the sea, a vibration so powerful it vibrated up through the granite of the island and into my bones. The windows of the lantern room rattled in their frames. The approaching soldiers froze, looking out at the churning water. The gray, stormy sea around St. Jude's Rock began to foam, not from the wind, but as if it were boiling. Then it rose. It was not a machine. It was not a monster. It was a life form of impossible scale and grace. The being from my visions, the castaway from a two-sunned world, emerged from the St. Jude's deeps. Ribbons of bioluminescent flesh, the size of city blocks, unfurled from the depths, casting a ghostly blue-green light on the chaos. It was a living mountain, a cathedral of flesh and light that dwarfed the lighthouse, its immense alien form eclipsing the sky. It had no eyes, but I felt its attention, its focus, as a palpable, overwhelming pressure. As it ascended, a wave of pure energy washed over the island. The roar of the helicopter's engine died instantly, replaced by a dead metallic silence as its electronics were fried. It tilted, then fell into the sea with a sickening splash. The soldiers' radios went dead. The lights on their rifles flickered out. They were stranded, disarmed, and utterly insignificant before the god that now loomed over them. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of absolute authority. The soldiers didn't even raise their dead weapons. They were statues, their faces masks of pure, primal awe and terror. In the sudden ringing silence, standing in the lantern room, I felt one last direct touch in my mind. There were no images, no words. It was a feeling of immense, profound gratitude, a feeling of sorrowful farewell. Thank you. Goodbye, my friend. Then, with a movement that defied physics, the colossal being sank back beneath the waves, taking its light and its mystery with it, leaving only a dark, roiling sea and a stunned, terrified silence. My name is Thomas Weaver. That is what I tell them every day. I live in a comfortable room with no sharp corners and a window that looks out onto a pleasant manicured lawn. There are no oceans here. Men and women in soft-spoken lab coats ask me the same questions again and again. They ask about frequencies, about visions, about the unprecedented seismic and electromagnetic event that led to the tragic loss of a special operations team during a training exercise. I tell them I was a lighthouse keeper. I tell them there was a storm. I tell them nothing else. The logbook is ash. The radio was taken and disassembled, yielding no secrets. The soldiers who survived saw something their minds cannot process and their superiors will not allow them to speak of. I am a madman. A loose end they're trying to tie up. But sometimes at night, when the facility is quiet, I look up at the stars. I think of the silent darkness between them. I am alone, but I am not empty. I know that the universe is not a silent, lonely place. I know that great, wonderful, and terrifying things sleep in the deep places of the world, and I know that one of them, somewhere, remembers me. I was the keeper of a light, a watcher on a lonely rock. And for a short, brilliant time, I was the friend of a stranger from a faraway star. And that, I think, is enough.